Sociology 345, video lecture 11. Culture as meaningful practice. Everything we've done so far has been looking at theoretical perspectives on the relationships between culture and society. This lecture will be the last one of that kind of lecture. After this one, we're going to be looking at case studies. We're going to be looking at ethnographies of culture in action. And really everything we've looked at so far, along with what will be presented right here, gives us the ability to appreciate and understand culture as a set of practices, culture as meaningful practice. So in some sense, what we'll talk about now will pull everything together, or allow us to pull everything together, really. We're going to talk about three different intellectual traditions. The first is phenomenology. The second is semiotics. And the third, which is more properly sociological, is symbolic interactionism. So we'll start with phenomenology, and we can say that once again we're talking about that period, the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, when so much was going on. Philosophical tradition, Edmund Husserl is usually associated with this school of thought as the originator, the central figure in this philosophical tradition. And the question at the center of this tradition is this: what is the nature of true knowledge and experience? And what Husserl told us is that there are two modes of experience. First, we can talk about pure experience, and I've represented it here with someone meditating. Pure experience is experience without reflection, almost without consciousness, but not quite, without self-consciousness. So you can think about pure experience if you've ever had the kind of this kind of experience where, let's say, you're driving on an open road on the highway for a long period of time, and you're traveling along, and then suddenly realize as you begin to reach your destination that you really have no clear memory of, say, the last 45 minutes or whatever it was. And you realize that you haven't been fully aware of yourself. You haven't been asleep, that's for sure, because if you fall asleep behind the wheel of a car, you crash it. But you've just been sort of in a kind of stream of consciousness, in the moment, in that thing that athletes sometimes call the zone, where everything is just happening and working, but you're not really thinking in a reflective way about yourself and your place in the world. The other type of experience is reflexive, which sounds like reflective, but it's not quite the same thing. Reflexive is a more kind of automatic reflection, a more kind of automatic self-consciousness. And this is the kind of consciousness that dominates human experience, where we are interpretive beings. We are interpreting situations. We are acting on the basis of motivation, and our motivations arise as we interpret things, and our interpretations are guided by what's in front of us and what Husserl called our stocks of knowledge. All the various stuff that we've been socialized into to understand the world and to understand ourselves. To illustrate that one, we have this silly cartoon, but I think you'll get the point. A couple is talking, and here's what was said. "Honey, tomorrow is that picnic with my colleagues. Do you think I should wear that new dress I got with the blue ribbon?" And he says, "I guess so, if you want." And then what was actually heard was something more like, "You can't watch football tomorrow. You're fat." That is, the world is a complex place precisely because we are in it as reflexive beings, and we are constantly in a mode of interpretation and creating understandings out of the world. And what makes social life so interesting, what makes culture so interesting, is the variety of ways that we understand and misunderstand and coordinate our actions with one another based on our understandings and motivations and misunderstandings, etc., etc. Second set of ideas we're interested here in is semiotics, which is a linguistic science of signs. Also emerging in that striking period between the 19th and the 20th century. This is developed by Ferdinand de Saussure, the French linguist. There he is. And he was busy during his life trying to understand how people communicate. And he came to an understanding of this thing he called the communicative act. And he said the communicative act is this. It is the combination of a signifier, a signified, which taken together can create meaning, and out of that arises a sign. So a signifier is a physical object, like a sound, the sounds that I'm making with my mouth and vocal cords right now, or an image, or the printed words that you're looking at. These are objects, and they are signifiers. They signify something. What they signify is some sort of mental concept, signified. And if communication is taking place, if there is a communicative act, the result is a sign, what Saussure called the associative total of signifier plus signified. So if you take a simple example, the signifier dog, that sound that I just made, dog, or I might spell it out, D-O-G, and you might see it as a word. That is a signifier. And what it signifies, if we're actually communicating, is some mental image of this thing that we're familiar with, this four-legged, usually four-legged, furry animal, domesticated animal. And when that mental image is triggered in your head, then the combination of that signifier dog and that image has created a sign. Now what's interesting about this, and what'll become interesting for us, especially when we're reading the Hebdige book later on the punk movement, what's interesting is that the relationship between the signifier and the signified is completely arbitrary. And there's no actual reason, logical reason why DOG should be associated with that mental concept of, well, what we think of, the dog. So think about it this way: if you know, perro, P-E-R-R-O, works just as well, and if you speak Spanish, then you understand, you know, it's the same thing. You get the same image. It's completely arbitrary what we use as signifiers and what they're connected to in terms of signifieds. So, for example, when you're reading a language or looking at a language that you don't understand, what you have there is access to the signifiers, but no access to the signifieds, and therefore no signs are created. And one of the interesting things we'll be looking at in terms of culture and subcultures is the way that subcultures will often take signs of a culture and rework them and sever the relationship between signifier and signified and create new relationships and new and innovative relationships, sometimes threatening relationships. And like I said, we'll be very interested in that when we're reading the Hebdige book. This is the famous painting from Magritte, which says in French, "This is not a pipe." Because it's not. What is it? It's a picture of a pipe. That's a different thing. We have to remind ourselves that there's an arbitrary relationship between what we call this thing and what it actually is. And we forget that all the time. So most of the time we would look at an image like that and say, yeah, it's a pipe. But of course it's not. It doesn't have anything to do with a three-dimensional pipe. It's a conventional way we understand to represent this thing. But if we're not trained in Western history, Western sort of visual traditions, it might not register as a pipe. And of course, Magritte was famous for playing with these kinds of relationships. So we've got this philosophical tradition of phenomenology, which is all about meaning and creating meaning and interpreting. And then we've got this idea of semiotics, which shows us some of the mechanics of how interpretation happens in the construction of these languages. Phenomenology and semiotics have some shared central ideas or principles. Cultural objects are not meaningful in their own right. People make meaning out of culture rather than apprehend meaning in culture. And meanings depend on the creative interplay of stocks of knowledge, the various ideas and perspectives that we bring to a situation, that situation or social context, and then our motivations within that social context. These all come into play in a very creative way in the construction of meaning. And so in the same way that we talked of society as a social construction in the very first week of this course, now we're coming to recognize that culture and meaning is also a construction, an ongoing set of emergent meanings that are constantly open to change. And this is important to remember when we begin reading our ethnographies, our studies of subcultures, etc., because what the researchers are trying to do in these ethnographies and what we want to get on board with them doing at the same time is trying to understand how the people they're studying make meaning, how the world appears to those people, not whether or not those people have got the right interpretation or the wrong interpretation, whether they're objectively correct or wrong, but just rather understanding the meanings that they do create, understanding why those would be the meanings that they create, and therefore understanding something larger about the relationships between these cultures and subcultures and the societies within which and through which they emerge. All right, so finally then we have symbolic interactionism, which is a North American school of thought, and the term was coined in 1937 by this man, Herbert Blumer, who at the time was a professor of sociology at the University of Chicago, eventually ended up at the University of California, Berkeley. And this is a sociological tradition now, a school of thought, that is focused on micro-interactions, especially face-to-face interactions between people, trying to understand, and by bringing to bear ideas around, and very similar to semiotics, ideas around and very similar to phenomenology, bringing those ideas to bear on how it is that people get things done and how then both meanings and then social groups and social structures get constructed. I use the Rock'em Sock'em Robots because Herbert Blumer liked to use analogies, sports analogies, and he often talked about boxers as an example of symbolic interaction. The way that boxers have to be aware of not just reacting to what they think they see, but reacting to what they think their opponent thinks that they are reacting to, if that makes sense. So they're not just looking for punches coming at them, they're looking for feints and fakes and dodges. And they both know that they're both doing this at the same time. So we do this naturally in everyday interaction. And it's reflexive. It's sort of automatic. If we had to actually think about it, I don't think we could actually get much communication or anything else done. I mean, if we're constantly wondering, is she thinking that I'm thinking that he's thinking that she thinks that I, it'll drive you crazy. But it's always going on. And the basic principles of these interactions, all interactions, are something like this, according to Herbert Blumer. We act toward things and toward each other on the basis of meaning, and the meaning that these things have for us. And these meanings are emergent in social action and interaction, really. They're constantly being negotiated and renegotiated, almost unconsciously, but not quite. Social action then results from a fitting together of these individual lines of action, so that basically people come together, they try to understand one another's motivations and ideas, and fit these things together, fit their understanding of a given situation to another person's understanding of that situation, in order to make things happen, in order to work cooperatively, or to work against one another, whatever it might be. This depends a great deal on the idea of the definition of the situation. That is, everyone comes together and through interactions come to an agreement about what is going on. And you can see this very dramatically in things like what the psychologists call the bystander effect. The idea that when there are large numbers of people around and someone gets hurt, it actually takes them longer to get assistance than if there are fewer people around. You can attribute that to a confusion about the definition of the situation. It's similar to when I'll ask a question in a large classroom full of students, and it'll take a very long time for someone to raise their hand and give an answer. Whereas if I ask the same question to 2 or 3 students, maybe in office hours, I'll get an answer immediately. And it's because in that larger group, there's maybe some confusion, or people are somewhat ambivalent about what exactly the definition of the situation is. What kind of class is this? Is this the kind of class where people talk? Who's going to talk first? What's going to happen when they talk? Etc., etc. So people come together, they fit their individual lines of action together, and they work together to get things done. So you've got phenomenology, semiotics, and symbolic interactionism. Again, all ideas that we're going to be coming back to as we analyze the social world in the ethnographies we're reading coming up. You put all these things together, and we talk about reading the social world as if it were a text. So just like reading, we're constructing meaning out of signifiers, just like we're constructing meaning out of words in a text, only we're reading the social world as if it were a book or a movie. It's important to remember then that texts are polysemic. What does that mean? Well, it's a fancy way of saying that texts have multiple meanings. People can interpret texts, the same text, differently. People can interpret the same social situation differently. They don't necessarily interpret it in an infinite number of ways, but they do interpret it. And we can understand and make sense of these interpretations because they are constrained by social structures, by discursive resources, and by the immediate social context. And what I mean by that is, if I show a film clip in a class of like 35 students, that film clip is a text and it's polysemic. Always. It has multiple meanings. People can interpret it differently. And we understand this intuitively. People will often say, well, everybody sees whatever they want to see, or everybody can take their own meaning from it. And that's kind of correct, but it's not exactly correct. Because if I show a film clip to 35 students, I will not get 35 different interpretations. Out of 35 students, I'll probably get, I don't know, maybe 5 different interpretations at the most. And that's because those people doing the interpretation share some things. They share social structures. That is, they are all students. They are all of maybe a similar age. There are similarities that the men in the room will share, and similarities that the women in the room will share. And the ethnicities might have shared experiences. These are all constraints on the meanings that will arise due to social structures. Connected to those social structures are the discursive resources that people have, their understandings of how to make meaning, the kinds of experiences or stocks of knowledge they have, the things acquired in habitus, if you were going to take Bourdieu's perspective, or the level of education that you have. These things will help determine the kind of interpretation you make. And the more of those discursive resources you share with other people, the more your interpretations are going to be similar to theirs. And then, of course, it's always the case that the immediate social context will put constraints on the kind of interpretations that happen. So if I show you a film clip in a classroom, you're immediately going to come at it with a certain kind of perspective that would be different than if you were shown a film clip in your dorm room, on your roommate's laptop. It's just a different social situation, and it dictates a different kind of attitude. So what we want to get comfortable with is this idea that we're all engaged in interpretation. The ethnographies that we're going to be reading are interpretations of what the researcher saw, and what the researcher is trying to make sense of is all the ongoing interpretations made by the various social actors being studied. So it's always interpretation on top of interpretation on top of interpretation. But that's not the same thing as saying that it's all relative and that could all just be anything. Because we can actually understand the structure of interpretation in the same way that we can understand the structure of culture and the structure of society. So that's an interpretation that doesn't quite make any sense. And that's why it's funny. This artist looking at a cuddly polar bear and painting a character from South Park. It's silly and absurd because we know it just can't quite work. So, like I said, this is the last of our purely kind of theoretical examinations of culture and society. And what we're going to start doing next week is bringing all of this material to bear on empirical cases.